right. Well, hello, everybody. How are you?
We're good.
Very good. Good. As if anyone's going to say, I'm really terrible. You're here to see Ryan Rodgers. Well, thank you all so much for coming tonight. My name is Emily Krupczewski. I'm the site manager here at the Washington County Heritage Center. If you've not gotten a chance to visit us, we are open Tuesday through Saturday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Our next event is actually coming up pretty fast. It's next Tuesday. We're going to have Ken Engel. He is from the Jewish Speakers Association. His parents actually survived the Holocaust. So he's going to be talking about their experience. That's next Tuesday at 7. We also got the Warden's House and Hay Lake School opening up in May. So that's much longer till we have all of our sites open for the summer. So quick intro for our speaker tonight. Ryan Rodgers is a freelance writer and avid skier whose work has been published in Backpacker, The Sun, Minnesota Conservation Volunteer, Hamlin, and Northern Wilds magazines. The former board president of the Standing Cedars Community Land Conservancy, a 1,500-acre nonprofit land trust along the St. Croix River. He lives with his family in northern Minnesota. We're very fortunate to have him here tonight, and I know he has books available as well, I believe.
Yeah, I do have a few, yes.
He has a couple, so if you want to grab one from him, make sure you see him. So without further ado, Ryan Rodgers.
All right, well, good to see everyone here, especially all these familiar faces, many of whom I haven't seen for a while. I'll start off with a word about the cover there. That's Ole Mangset and his 3 sons in Minneapolis in 1924. His oldest boy there had just won the Class C national championship for ski jumping, which was held at Glenwood Park that year, as Worth Park was formerly called. And like all these, well, like many of the leading skiers of the early 1900s, Ole had been born and raised and learned to ski in Norway and emigrated here as a young man. And he really was a top skier in the Minnesota and national scene for some years. That's him, I would say, in the 1910s, 1910s, somewhere there up at Chester Bowl. As you can see, they had quite a different style of jumping back then compared to now. And when I started working on this, I didn't realize how ski jumping was the dominant form of skiing up until World War II. It was a mainstream American sport, which was really a bonus because there was so little going on with cross country, which was going to be the focus of my book up until the 60s or so. Ole Mangset, he first moved to Wisconsin, Spooner, Wisconsin. He settled in. And he looked for a ski hill there, but he could not find one. The first winter he was there farming with his brother. And the next year they moved to near Frederick, and there they found a ski hill, and they fashioned a ski jump on the hill. I imagine it was a snow ramp. I don't think it would have been a wooden scaffolding or anything. But they gathered one Sunday, area farmers gathered they'd never seen skiing before. This would have been in the first years of the 1900s. And Ole's brother John, he took a jump off the slide, and he soared and he landed, and everyone was impressed. This wild, crazy Norwegian sport. Ole followed. He hadn't jumped for a couple of years. He launched off the slide, and it was a yard sale. He smashed into the snow. His skis went flying, and these farmers were not pleased by this reckless behavior that was taking place. It was actually not the Mangset's land. It was a neighbor's land. These neighbors almost put a stop to this behavior before it got out of hand. But Ole, he put his skis back on. He nailed the jump, and for a while there, the residents of rural Frederick would come and watch the crazy Norwegians of Seven Pines, as they called them. Ole was later recruited to jump for the Red Wing team, and then for the Coleraine team up on the Iron Range, and the Mangsets still live up there today. I did a talk up there a year ago, and I met this guy here who is Ole's grandson, which was pretty cool. I didn't know that jumping was such a short man sport. I met all these jumpers, and really felt at home. But Bruce Mangset, he's a retired school teacher. He brought these prizes his grandfather had received in Norway for winning tournaments there. And just like silver spoons and a cake scooper, I guess that is. That one's upside down. Says OM, Holy Mangseth. There it is. The one says Eleverum, which is where he was from in Norway, and then this other one is dated February 1897. I can't make out the top of that, but I thought those were pretty cool. Shifting gears, great to be here in the St. Croix Valley. I lived in Osceola for 12 years and always enjoyed the valley, which has such a rich skiing history. It really goes back to the origins of the sport in the US. Stillwater had one of the first ski teams, as you can see pictured here, in 1888, which was right when things were starting out. And you can read the names there. There's a bit of a Norwegian influence. Nels and Jens and Hans, Ole Olsen, of course, can't forget him. And there was a jump right over by the hospital, right down the road, actually, at Lily Lake. I imagine it was on the hill right behind the lake. There's a pretty steep hill back there. And I've never seen any pictures of it. I don't know how big it was, and I'm not sure how long this team was around, but for a time there was a jump there on Lily Lake. Just kind of, gloss over the history of skiing in the area quick. This was a favorite photo of mine. It's the Dells of the St. Croix up in Interstate Park. This was much later in the 1940s, but I mean, you could pose two people out there today and it would look pretty much the same, as long as the ice is good and solid. Here's a ski train. They call this up at Taylor's Falls. There was a sliding hill in Taylor's Falls. I think that's the depot in Taylor's Falls there. Imagine the train would come in and drop people off, and some entrepreneurial person would perhaps shuttle them over to the sliding hill. And this would have been a very casual type of skiing, almost like sledding, really. I know there were a few short-lived downhill areas, of course, aside from Trollhagen and Wild Mountain. There was Barker's Alps, which was close to here. I know some people here have even skied there back some time ago. And there was there's a little hill in St. Croix Falls, started by Kurt Momsen, who was also involved with starting Trollhagen. There's this old foundation of a building off the Ice Age Trail right in town, and it was years ago. The guy who had a bike shop in St. Croix Falls, Frank Lundeen, I was cutting honeysuckle for him around this foundation, and we didn't know what it was, but I happened to talk to somebody who explained to me that this was the short-lived downhill ski area right off the Ice Age Trail, the Mindy Creek section. And you can still see that foundation there. But this map is from Englewood, which is up the river a ways, south of Osceola, north of Somerset. I believe people here have also skied there back when it was in operation, and you can still see the runs back there. It's a really neat area with steep hills, and the lifts. They didn't have chair lifts, but they had a rope tows, and the rope tows were powered by vehicles parked on blocks, and the ropes would be tied around the rims, and they just run the cars and they power the ropes these ways. And some of the vehicles are still out there. There are a couple. What's that? Oh, sorry. There's a big propane line that goes under the river, and if you follow that propane line, one of those vehicles is along there. That whatever company has
Ryan,
it.
there's a sign that says head wall, you see that?
Mm-hmm.
And that ran straight down a really steep angle, right to the St. Croix River. There was no run out. They go over there as high school kids, and I mean, it was suicide going up there. We get a lot of Turner.
I wonder if that's where the gas line is now, because
Very right next to it.
oh, okay. Okay. Oh, that's cool. Arnold Kustrich was the guy who put Englewood together. I tried to get a hold of him some years back, but I never managed to connect with him. Yeah, so the ski area is here now. Yeah, there's that gas line, so head wall would have been
Right there.
right. Yeah. Okay.
You know, the actual owner was Engelhart. And you know where that brick farmhouse is, right across the street, you live not too far from it.
I think it's Foxtail Farm now. It's a CSA farm.
Yeah. And Engelhart owned the land, and he leased it out as a ski area. But he was very religious, and he would come down there and he'd check everybody to make sure they weren't carrying wineskins.
Oh, so you're gonna ski head wall. You don't have to- I think that's the old Engelhart
Yeah.
farm, unless I'm mistaken. He had a brother too, didn't he? Or
Yeah.
two?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the footprint of the chalet is still there. It was torn down. I think the first time I saw it would have been 2010. It was already torn down. But yeah, not a whole lot left to see. But I heard until not too far before that, there was still, there was still like even old boots and just people had kind of walked away and left it as it was.
And did all that become standing cedars? then? All that land?
Yep, this plot there's that interesting scout camp. I don't know if it's an actual scout camp, but they have that really cool cabin
Yeah, it is.
down there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the red are private in holdings. The rest is standing cedars. I believe the Custridge family still owns this. It's like 170 acres there. They've got a little landing down there. It's that backwater up from William O'Brien. Yeah, but you can the whole old ski area is it's walkable now. I'll zoom way back out now to the origins of skiing here in the region. Skiing, of course, is ancient, practiced for hundreds of years, thousands of years by Scandinavians and people in a part of China. This is from the first time it was really written about in any detail in the 1500s by this Swede he was a Catholic archbishop, and when Catholicism was no longer the hegemony in Sweden, he was sent into exile in Rome, and he wrote this book about the northern peoples, and became kind of a classic. And he pined for his northern homeland, and he wrote about skiing. And it wasn't really a sport per se. It was a part of life. It was a form of transportation, a way of survival in the winter. So you can see these people are out hunting. There's a Sammy woodcut of a similar scenario, out skiing and hunting, apparently fending off a wolf attack. And the first people who brought skiing to North America used it for similar ways. There was letters written by a Norwegian pastor in Wisconsin, and he wrote about his fellow Norwegian immigrants, how they would chase the deer on their skis until the deer were so exhausted they would plunge their knives into the deer and eat them that way. And actually, the first written record of a person skiing in North America is a guy Norwegian in Wisconsin in 1841. He had put on his skis to go buy flour, and the next day his neighbors were really disturbed by what had left these odd tracks in the snow. Was it some sort of monster? Surely somebody had skied before him. That's about as early as the written record goes back that I could find. And in that same time in Norway, skiing was developing as an organized sport. This is from one of the early competitions in Christiania, as Oslo was then called. The competitions were a mix of what we call jumping, downhill, and cross country today. They'd have a little course and do all three. As you can see, that person there is jumping with a small stick that they use for balance. Back in the US, a short-lived ski racing scene sprung up in the Sierra Nevada. in gold mining camps when these miners were looking for something to do in the winter. And this was in the mountains, and they put on these really long 10, 12-foot skis, and they just bombed down the mountainsides as fast as they could. And supposedly getting, hitting speeds of 70 or 80 miles an hour. And they were really into wax, which they called dope. So these posters, like this one here says dope is king, and they had secret recipes for their wax. Using things like whale spermaceti and turpentine, and these were closely held secrets. But this league didn't last long, and skiing would not catch on in the West for many years after this. The first ski leagues that sprung up were here in the Midwest, the first ski leagues that lasted and developed. There's some Norwegian skiers back in I think this is a little later, 1880s. Heavy wool clothes, heavy mustaches, heavy wooden skis. There's a Norwegian who really pushed the sport forward and wound up moving to Minnesota, the North Dakota, and his name was Sondre Norheim. He was from Telemark. He was this peasant farmer carpenter. He wasn't known as a good farmer or a good carpenter, but he was good at playing his fiddle and skiing. And when this big annual tournament started happening in the capital, one year he skied the 100 plus miles to participate. And the story goes that he was mocked for his peasant clothes by the sophisticated Christianians, whether that's true or not, or just part of this story. I don't think anyone would ever be able to say, but it kind of makes for a good folk hero story. And he, of course, when the competition started, he dominated and everyone was wowed. And for some time, he became something of a celebrity, probably the world's first ski star. And he was in his early 40s when he first started winning these tournaments, which is pretty inspiring to some of us. But he had a good run of several years, and then he was too old. He couldn't keep up anymore, and he was back to being a poor farmer and carpenter. And he, like so many Norwegians, he emigrated to Minnesota following his son, and then he wound up in North Dakota, where he lived out his years in a sod hut in northern North Dakota outside of Minot. And his cabin in Telemark has become kind of a place of pilgrimage for skiers. That's it right there. He would do crazy things like ski jump off the roof of these cabins. I don't exactly know how that worked. I guess maybe the snow would get high enough they could build a ramp that went from the slope up the roof. I'm not sure, but he was a de facto coach to all these kids from Morgadal. But he wound up dying in the end of the 1800s, and he was buried in an unmarked grave, which people forgot about until the late 1950s, when a descendant of his tried to find out where he was. And there was this really interesting story about her contacting the Norwegian pastor in this small town where he had died. And the Norwegian pastor went out, and he knew of two graves. One guy had been buried in the 1890s. The other guy had been buried later. So this pastor figured the guy who died first would be buried in a wooden coffin. The other guy would be buried in a metal coffin. And he waited for some rain, a long soaking rain, and he went out with a piece of rebar. And he rammed this long piece of rebar down into the ground. And on the first one he hit something solid, tunk, tunk, tunk. So he realized, that's metal. So this is not Sondre Norheim. He went to the other unmarked grave, other unknown, unlabeled grave, and he kept pounding it down, and that it kept going down. And so he determined that was the grave of Sondre Norheim, buried in a wooden coffin that had since disintegrated. Now there's this stone and plaque there. There's an old church across the street. It's all surrounded by farm fields, reached on this narrow 2-track road that gets narrower and sketchier, but it's a pretty neat place above the Mouse River, the Source River, as they call it in Canada. But back in Norway, he had all these kids had come up skiing, being taught by the great Sondre Norheim, including a couple brothers who would move to Minnesota and be the first American ski stars. These are the young skiers of Morgadal in the 1880s. The first ski leagues that popped up here were with the first winter carnival, which I think was a couple years before this poster. The winter carnival had been prompted when an Eastern newspaper spoke poorly of St. Paul, saying it was like Siberia and unfit for human inhabitation, which prompted the local boosters to prove them wrong and put on a festival that would showcase the joys of a northern winter. So they started the winter carnival, which was based on club sports with, you know, activities like tobogganing and of course skiing. So prior to this first carnival, hurriedly ski teams were formed to compete. And this is at the first winter carnival. There was supposed to be a competition with jumping and cross-country racing, but the snow melted. And I mean, it's a heck of an ice palace, and that thing's incredible. But you can see a lot of bare grass there. They didn't have snowmaking equipment back then. And here are the clubs. For some reason, they're sharing skis. They're doubling up on the skis. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe they didn't have enough to go around. They were big into uniforms. I'm sure these were very bright and colorful uniforms. The Stillwater picture we saw, that was one of these clubs that was formed to for the winter carnival. St. Paul had one, Minneapolis had one, St. Croix Falls had one. And St. Croix Falls managed to poach here's this one again, but St. Croix Falls managed to poach the best skier the area had, Michael Hemmesby, who had just arrived from Norway, where he had won the big annual competition there once or twice. So he went to St. Croix Falls, where they set him up managing a ski making company, which was possibly the first ski making company in the US or all of North America. It was called the Excelsior Ski Company. It didn't last very long. They made solid single piece wood skis, and they used steam boxes, and so they would have bent them into shape, and they would have been heavy, and there were skis like this with like a simple leather thong there, and then a sort of a leather belt strap that went around the heel. But those are the Hemmesby boys. Michael was the first to come. He went to St. Croix Falls, where for a couple seasons he led this really great ski club. And there's a pastor across the river in Taylor's Falls who would sit in his office, writing his sermons, or probably, and looking out across the river at this. There's a big esker in St. Croix Falls behind where the hospital is there. The Ice Age Trail goes over it now. It's all heavily wooded, but back in the day, I imagine everything was freshly logged and bare. And Michael's Hemmesby would lead the St. Croix Falls team doing their practice jumps there. And this professor the pastor just marveled at this crazy activity, the likes of which he had never seen before. And he left this sketching of it, which is kind of fun. It wasn't long before the more serious ski club in Red Wing poached Michael away from St. Croix Falls, and he moved there. Later was joined by his brother Torjus, who had just won the world's first ski marathon in Norway at 50 kilometers. And there was this whole debate amongst the educated folk in Christianity of whether a human body could withstand the exertions of a 50-kilometer race. A lot of people feared that the skiers would just start dying, which is ironic because the ways north in the hinterlands at Telemark and really all over the country, people were using skis daily for their survival and skiing great distances on a regular basis. But Torjus won that race. When I skied the Birkie, the classic one, while writing this book, my goal was to beat his time, which was either 4 or 4.5 hours for 50K. And he had those wooden, he would have had wooden skis like that. He used a single staff. I'm not sure if they went to the side or if they went between the legs, but that's how they skied then. And the time proved to be more challenging than I thought it would be. But for some, these guys had a great run in Red Wing. They were the best. They were the best skiers in the country. They won all the tournaments. They were together again. And then there's kind of a cool picture of a tournament in Glenwood, Minnesota, which had a big Norwegian population and therefore a ski scene. And, you know, as you can see, the snow is not ideal. And I think that's a jumper there. I believe that's what's going on there. That the slide is out of our sights, and yeah, the skiers. The caption there mentions the Hemispeeds. I would assume they handily won that, but you know, it was a pretty big deal. This was a popular national magazine, Frank Leslie's Illustrated. And there's a dramatized version of I think that's Torjus winning a tournament there at Red Wing. You know, I haven't seen where that mountain is in Red Wing, but I'm assuming it's there somewhere. But later that same year, the economy tanked and the ski league kind of went by the wayside for a while. The Hemispeeds were well known for their ski making skills. This is the tip of a Torjus Hemispeed ski up in Red Wing, down in Red Wing. It's kind of cool. I think it's made out of oak. It's a heavy ski. They have it in the county museum there. Ski league went bust though. Torjus and Michael went their separate ways. Michael went back to Norway. Torjus went to Western Minnesota. He farmed there for the rest of his days. Ironically, that panic of 1893 prompted the Minnesota Wisconsin ski industry, there's another Norwegian guy, Martin Strand, moved to Minneapolis. He didn't speak any English. He lived with all these Norwegians there. He got a job as a surveyor in northern Wisconsin. This is not him, but this is a survey crew in northern Wisconsin, and he surveyed rail lines through the Virgin Pines up there. And he was doing great for a while. He had his own surveying company, Martin Strand, and then the panic hit and he went bankrupt. He went on business. He went back to Minneapolis, where he observed these boys skiing on these poor quality barrel stave skis, and which gave him an idea. I'm going to start my own ski company. This is Linda Christensen. She lives a ways north of here, but she learned how to ski on a barrel stave ski, a set of barrel stave skis. And that's the barrel stave ski her father made for her. I imagine in the late 50s, 60s. It was from a nail keg. And he just added a little wooden block there in the middle for her foot. And that's a stave ski. But Strand started churning out skis in Minneapolis, and it took him a while, but he had some big success with that for a while. And once the economy recovered, a new ski league was formed, National Ski Association, and skiing it took off. Tournaments started up again. They even started a cross country national, which is still going on today. This was the first winner of the U.S. National Ski Meet, Asario Atio from Ely. Looks like a pretty fit dude. And he won it one year, and then I don't know what happened to him after that. He challenged anyone to beat him. He said he'd give them $100. I was unable to determine if anyone took him up on it or what happened after that. There's some aspiring boy skiers, and I think in the UP, it started to become a pretty big thing. That's Red Wing, the ski hill there. Kind of a cool picture. They had a couple different jumps there. And there were serious skiers, and then of course, like today, there are a lot of recreational skiers. A young couple out for a jaunt with some, thick poles they obviously cut out of the woods to use for their hands. Little ski pockets developed, including one that's still going on in Stoughton, Wisconsin. I mean, that's a heck of a jump there. A lot of these ski towns jumping towns have disappeared. The jumping scene has anyway, but Stoughton's still hanging on by a thread. And there were superstars that came out of this. There's John Mangseth, Zoli's brother, Tolov Hemispeed. I think that's a nephew of the brothers. another Ole Fearing, Olaf Janum, and Anders Haugen, well, they call it Anders Haugen, was kind of the superstar. He and his brother dominated the US ski jumping scene for 20 years. And the Duluth skier, he looks like he's having a good old time. There's this dog named Spock in the 1920s that would ski the landing slopes beneath the jumps. And his front paws are fixed to the skis, but his back legs were free. And he would go around to the tournaments, and supposedly he loved it. They had a parade once, the Duluth Ski Club, and they had a little miniature jump on their float. And they put this dog on the jump, and they'd set him down, and he'd slide off, and the guy would catch him, put him back on, and that's how the parade went through town. That was good for Martin Strand, who finally found a permanent factory spot in New Richmond after his 2 Minneapolis factories. Well, one in Minneapolis, one in St. Paul. They both burned down. And they made him one in New Richmond, and he became the town's biggest employer for some time there. Parts of that factory still exist. I think it's like a boat storage facility now. Strand had bought out another local ski maker, Anders, Axel Holter. Holter was up in Ashland, Wisconsin. It's a real interesting character. There's an old Strand binding, real primitive, just a leather strap over the toe. He advertised via catalogs that were kind of like magazines. They had how-to articles. The ski here was called the Jumper's Freak Model, which is a pretty cool name for a ski. There's this factory I believe that was in the 40s in New Richmond. He was the first ski salesperson to sell skis at the Minnesota State Fair, although this was at the North American Centennial on the state fairgrounds. And he did make a lot of toboggans and canoe paddles. And when the National Ski Association sent a pair of skis to President Coolidge, they commissioned Strand to build him a real nice set, presented them to him on the White House lawn there. But Strand was, he lost his position as the #1 ski maker to this character, Christian Lund, who was the president of Northland Skis for a long time. And Lund was he was savvier at advertising, made these really cool looking catalogs. And he sponsored most of the Olympic team. This is the first US Olympic ski team. They're pretty much all these guys are from Minnesota or Wisconsin. Their coach was the mayor of Minneapolis, George Leach. It's in Chamonix, France during the games. There's Ragnar Ontvedt. I think he was from Michigan, if I recall. Multiple time national champion. And here are the Haugen brothers. One of the brothers he didn't want to jump on the Olympic team because he wanted to keep winning prize money. So his brother joined, but they were real impressive jumpers. Over the course of 20 years, they won one of them won the national jumping title more times than not. They were winning it up until their late 30s. And I believe it was Anders actually won a bronze medal in that 24 games, which is the only jumping medal the US has ever won. There they are with their Northland sweaters, and the guy between the Haugens is Hans Hansen, another Minneapolis guy, and there's Carl Howelson, who was a champion skier who got things going in Steamboat Springs, Colorado for skiing. This is in Steamboat. People were starting to discover the mountains and all the potential for skiing there. Hans Hansen, he was getting a little long in the tooth to keep up to the young guys at the tournament, so he started doing stunts when he was around 40. This is at Worth Park. He would do flips off the jump as an exhibition. He had a number of awful injuries. There were some good hospital photos we found in the process of making this, but he did that for some time. You know, it's a big crowd there. He's performing in front of. Carl Halson, the shortest guy there. He jumped for Barnum and Bailey Circus for some years. He toured, you know, ski sailing, the perilous Scandinavian winter sport and all its wild and wondrous daring. Which is pretty cool. They had dry land jumps that they used in place. I'd be curious to know what kind of jump he had practiced on when he toured around the country. But this puts us in the 30s and 40s, and the ski scene was well established. There was a new jump at Bush Lake that the James J. Hill family funded. There's an early tournament there. Cross country continued on as sort of a niche sport. This is the national championship one year when it was held in Red Wing. As you can see, it's pretty primitive. Just racing on the backwaters there. That's at Bush Lake, which is was it Highland Hills now? Yeah, the grooming leaves some to be desired, I'd say. And this is another national championship at Bush Lake. You can see those, those oak suckers or whatever they are, like riding the trail and the tufts of grass. It's a national championship. And I mean, the trail does indicate that it was going toward that fence in the back. And fence crossing was once considered a desirable feature of a ski course because it would show how dexterous the skier was to be able to climb over the fence. And you couldn't take off your skis because that would be real, not good at all. You gotta get over there. But yeah, and with World War II, that really changed everything after that. Downhill exploded in popularity, and jumping faded by the wayside, and cross country continued on as a small niche sport for some years until beginning to take off in the late 60s and 70s. Oh, and in the ski industry, the Midwestern ski industry would fade as well after World War II. I don't think any skis are even made in the US anymore. It's all European now. But there was even a ski binding manufacturer right up the river in Marine on St. Croix where Ralph Malmberg manufactured these bindings he sold in his ski shop above the general store in Marine. And I really like the box. I talked with Ralph a few years ago about this. It was his brother's friend did the box, but kind of very 60s-y vision of skiing to the woods. But is Ralph Malmberg still?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll leave it at that. I'll happy to answer any questions. And thanks for coming in tonight.
Ryan, I noticed the use of 2 poles versus a stick. When did that transition take place?
The book. At one of the early, it was pretty early in the 1900s. I remember one anecdote from a 1928-27 national championship held in Red Wing. And there was one old timer there who disagreed with the skiers using 2 poles. He thought it was better, but it would have been in that era. I'd have to look it up, Bob. I wish I remembered offhand, but it did last for some time. And then I'm sure it faded away quickly. Same with synthetic skis. Everyone had wooden skis up until the synthetics started creeping in, and then all of a sudden, boom, the wooden skis were gone, and everyone was using synthetic.
Question. So Ryan, obviously there was a lot of work that went into researching this. What motivated you to write this book?
Well, I was asked to write an article on the ski culture in Marine on St. Croix, which I lived nearby, which was prompted by Jesse Diggins' gold medal for the conservation volunteer. And I wrote that book, and I talked to a couple of you here for that. And talking to people, I was kind of really intrigued by the depth of the stories that people told about their relationship with skiing and how those stories intersected pretty cleanly through the generations, and it just seemed like there was a natural story arc there, and it turned out to, you know, hold true, especially in the early days. There were so few skiers, the stories just led one to another. I talked to one person, and the person would say, "Oh, you got to talk to so and so," and I talked to that person, and it just, and there were all these links that really made putting the narrative together fairly easy.
Yeah, what caused the return to cross country skiing, whenever that was, the fifties and sixties? What was the driver
Well,
there?
it would have been a number of things. You know, more rugged sports were more rugged outdoor pursuits are popular prior to World War II. And then World War II came, and it was stressful, and people were, you know, rationing things. And it was a hard time, you know, and the Depression was before that. Then after the war, there was kind of this glut, this consumer glut. You had all these GIs coming back from World War II who had been introduced to this really kind of fun and glamour-based European ski culture, and so they opened up downhill ski areas to replicate that experience. Like, you know, Tony Weiss was one with Mount Telemark, and I think, you know, people just got tired of that after a time. They started, you know, there was more of a focus on health, exercise. Downhill was also very expensive, so it priced a lot of families out of it. And cross country offered this healthy, lower cost alternative, and it took, you know, it was a slow increase in popularity starting in the late '60s, and, you know, it's kind of gradually increasing since then. But I mean, I'd say it's a, you know, it's a pretty, I'd say it's become a mainstream sport in Minnesota anyway. I mean, you look at Worth Park, it's just, it's a, you know, it's a different world than, you know, growing up back in the '80s and, you know, being in these little Bill Koch ski leagues. It's just, it's really snowballed since then. I think it will continue as, you know, as people are ever more focused on you know, on health and, you know, the benefits of exercise, the benefits of being out in nature. And, you know, there are more and more places that make snow. I think cross country skiing will continue to be a big deal in Minnesota.
Were some of the outfits that they fashioned for the ski teams reflective of the countries that they came from, I'm guessing, or were most of them kind of the same throughout the cultures?
That's a great question. I mean, almost all the skiers who formed these early clubs, they were pretty much all Norwegians. But they had very bright uniforms. I don't know if those colors had any representation due to their new town or their old town. There's a cool museum in the St. James Hotel in Red Wing, and they have an old wool Aurora Ski Club uniform up there. It's kind of neat. I mean, it's a whole different experience skiing in wool. But yeah, that's a good question. Wish I could stand more on
That was a great answer.
it.
Other question?
Travel to Norway for part of your research?
No, but one of these days I'll get there. Not been in Norway. I'd like to visit Morgedal. I did talk to some people, descendants of the Hemespeets, and they had all been to Morgedal. They were all dialed into their you know, their ancestors' skiing prowess, which is pretty cool.
You know what, when you look back at the records, starting in the thirties, Duluth is there year after year after year. And what started in Duluth, I mean, and to this day, it's still a very, very active ski community, you know.
Yeah, it's, I mean, with cross country, you can trace it back to them being a little precocious, you know, Charlie Banks being back in the 50s. You know, it was interesting looking at the high school state meets because it goes back a long ways. It's pushing 100 years of Minnesota State ski meets. And
those first, from the thirties, I mean, those first 20 years, it's all Duluth. Well, once in a while, another town may sneak in there, but.
there's some Coleraine in there, but it was heavily jumping.
And it was jumping, Chester Bowl was really big at the time, I don't know.
Yeah, and they would do cross country races, but it was more of an afterthought. Like even in the 50s, I talked to one guy and he said how the coach would come around shortly before the state meeting would say, who wants to do the cross country race? You know, it's just, they hadn't trained for it. But in terms of Duluth, there was one coach up there, Charlie Banks, who was training in a modern way back in the 1950s when really very few other people were doing that. The Bush Lake Ski Club did some of that in the 30s, and they wound up producing a couple of really good skiers because of that. And I think that the hills, though, I mean, also give people who ski in Duluth a big advantage, especially with the kids. They get used to, you know, skiing on those large hills every day. Jumping, I mean, it was a huge jumping scene, like the national jumping scene, which I imagine you know you have your Scandinavian population base, you have your multiple jumps.
You know, another one was Bouquet. They had like 13 years in a row. They were winning this high school championship, but they had a jump right in town. I know that's still there.
Yeah, they had a really passionate coach, Joe
Person.
Joe Nowak there.
Yeah. But that was cross country also. They had a very strong cross country.
Well, and there was you, Bill, who told me how the State High School League changed the scoring, which really set things up. So instead of what was it taking two,
ski 3 and count 2, and then they changed it to ski 6 and count 4, and now it's 7. It's changed again last year. So.
I
But
really
again, with a small school and a small number of skiers, you could still do very well. So. And then when they changed the format, you needed more depth, and that's when the metro schools started to come up with stronger teams.
This year's meet looked like it was pretty amazing. Were you up there?
Yeah, and it was Duluth all over again.
It was like split seconds though for the.
But no one was close to Duluth. And everybody knew that before the racing started.
There's
They
some
won
really.
boys, they won in girls. They won the boys relay, they won the girls relay. That doesn't happen very often.
There's some real serious parents up there. Took my kid, they have 2 ski leagues, I've taken my kids to both. The one is, it's pretty intense.
So the coaches are former Stillwater students.
How many ski shops burned down in your mind, in the area? There's
The
always
factories?
a good ski shop going, oh no, it burned down.
Well, ski factories used to burn down all the time. They're these wooden factories with piles of sawdust
Yeah,
and machinery. I mean, Strand lost 2 mine cart. Sure, they had like other, you know, there was that varnish and things like that they put on there. There was a big one in North St. Paul that burned down.
yeah.
it was one of Christian Lund's. It was either Lund or Northland. I forget which one.
I toured that as a Cub Scout when I was,
Yeah.
I went through that ski shop.
Okay. Must have been in the 50s. It burned.
No, it was in the 40s,
Okay.
early 40s.
Okay. That Lund was an interesting guy. He claimed to have invented Northland, but he hadn't. He'd wrestled it away from Martin Strand's former business partner. And this business partner had forced Strand out of his factory location. So it was kind of this cutthroat world of ski making for a while there. Lund had some tall tales. He said he was a champion ski jumper in Norway, which there's a Greg Fango, local historian, did a bunch of research on that and found that he had not done that. Lund claimed he'd gone to Norway to, train with these master ski makers, which I believe also was fabricated. But Northland ski was kind of the ski for decades, which was just kind of cool that it was this local product. But then when they couldn't keep up with the newer technologies, the split keen and things like that. Anything else?
Are you working on any research projects right now?
I'm writing a book about canoe adventures in the far north of Canada, which has been fun to work on. I have until the end of the year till November to finish it, which should be doable.
Cool. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it.
One more.
Oh, one more question.
Northland persisted into the 60s quite a bit, didn't it?
They were around quite a while. Yeah, and they tried making metal skis, which were a flop. And then there was hard skis that popped up. Hard skis were.
I worked at Afton Alps and I remember they bought a bunch of 6, 9 line Northland skis. This was a little, the late 50s. And we used the rental and we cut them off. To make them look at this things.
Those were still wooden.
Yeah, I think they were laminated.
Okay.
They're laminated wood.
Okay.
And they had a metal protector on the back that we took off. There's also a Lund ski factory from Hastings. In Hastings, do you have any information about that? That was Lund.
And Lund was owned by the same guy. It was I believe he would get jobs like Dayton's or J.C. Penney's. One of those department stores had skis, so they'd contract with Lund, and Lund would produce those skis. There was a slight different niche between Lund's and Northland's, though they were the same, owned by the same guy. I did read about that factory. They had one in New Hampshire too, a Lund factory. And Christian Lund ran it until he died. And his sons were in the business, and as soon as he died, they sold it. They got out of there. But business had been going downhill for a while. They couldn't keep up with the newer technologies.
That's because the new skis were faster. When they started passing up the woodies didn't catch on quick enough to change.
I mean, it should be a whole different experience skiing on especially downhill on wooden skis. I mean, the bindings would be a big difference too. If you were using those rat trap bindings. Yeah, I mean, it's probably a lot harder to turn in something like that, I would think. So. All right, I'll leave it at that. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you so much.